Hi, I'm Mary Thaler,
And I'm Jeffrey Edwards.
and this is Writing Off the Deep End. And in this episode, we're talking to Yilin Wang, who's joining us from Vancouver. Yilin is a literary translator and a poet and writes also short fiction, and I think has a novel project going, and she's going to talk to us about all of those. So welcome, Yilin.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd like to start by talking about literary translation because that's something we haven't covered yet on this video blog. You translate from Mandarin Chinese to English, and of course every language has its own particularities that can make translating a challenge. Can you tell us, just to start, a little bit about Mandarin Chinese?
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting translating from and occasionally into Mandarin because it's such a different language from English. It has a number of qualities that make it stand out, pose challenges for a translator. Things like not having a tense, for example, the lack of certain kinds of prepositions, like articles like a and the that we use, not having words be shown as plural, shu, like the addition of like the letter S, for example. And these are just some kind of grammatical qualities. But then we also have things like, idioms, more use of allusions in the text, just because it is a very ancient language that goes way back and has a lot of history and literature written in Chinese. And so authors often like to allude to what come before it. So that can pose another challenge as well. And also stylistic qualities as well. Like, for example, maybe there's a focus on conciseness or use of four-character idioms and that kind of thing. So there are a number of different challenges I'm working with because it's very different from English.
When you're thinking about your English audience, how much license do you give yourself to make changes to make it in line with maybe what an English reader would expect, and how much do you try to stick very faithfully to the Chinese and instead give them a sense of writing from a different culture?
Yeah, I think that's always one of the biggest challenges that translators have to deal with, finding that balance between two. And I think one of the conversations I've been having recently is drawing a distinction between just flow and domesticating into the language in terms of clarity and beauty of the language versus comfort of the reader in terms of, is it something familiar to them? And I think the first is something that I definitely want to aim for, just because I do want to create an independent work of art in English. I want a translation, that stand alone in addition to being a translation. But at the same time, I'm not necessarily going to adjust to the expectations because it is, a work of translation and it is drawing on different literary traditions. And I think part of the beauty of reading world literature and translated literature is opening yourself up to different types of traditions and different ways of storytelling. So I think the second one, more pushing the readers to be open and challenging them to maybe meet in the middle and really open themselves up to whatever the author is experimenting with, and that might not follow what English readers consider to be good writing.
And you translate poetry, which I imagine is a particularly difficult genre. I read one of your poems, and actually it was called Night Moths, and the author's name is Dai Wang Shu. And the very second line goes, "Night moths dance in wretched repetition." And in English, you've got this wonderful language thing happening. You've got the repetition of that wretched and wretched repetition, which is lovely. But I imagine didn't exist in exactly the same form in the original Chinese. So how do you sort of translate those language and sound qualities? Or do you even try?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think when we're talking about translating Chinese poetry, there's contemporary and modern poetry, and then there's classical. It's very different. A comparison would be, thinking about formal poetry in English versus free verse. And this falls in more modern category. And modern Chinese poetry, there's kind of less focus in general on things like rhythm and rhyme and meter. So in the Chinese poem itself, there's not that much of a focus on the sound. And this is I'm making a generalization here, but I would say in general, sound is not as prominent as of a technique in Chinese poetry, especially modern poetry, just because it is a language where each character is one syllable and you have a lot of characters that just sound similar. So you're just going to end up with a lot of words that just naturally rhyme. Writers will pay attention to, making the flow and that kind of thing. There might be use of repetition, use of line breaks. But in general, there's not really going to be as much focus on things like assonance or any of the common techniques we might see more frequently in English. But when I translate, I will still, look out for those opportunities, choosing the best sounding words, trying to capture flow and the feel. That line is very much about repetition thematically. So wretched was a word that I came up with after thinking a lot about what would be the right word to capture that kind of emotion, because that word can be translated in many ways into like in the tragic or sad or like wretched, or it has a lot of synonyms. So trying to find the right one, and then also one that works maybe in terms of the sound as well.
Yeah.
So do you write in Chinese, in Mandarin as well, or more in English in your own work?
I just write in English. Even though in Chinese I can definitely read and speak fluently, it's not as strong as my English.
Literary translation is a rather small area in the larger translation world. So what drew you translation in the first place?
Yeah, that is interesting. I never thought that I would go into translation just because I've always been interested in writing and creating work as a writer, as a poet. So when I write, I will naturally draw on those traditions as well. Even writing in English, I think a lot about things like, how do I incorporate, cultural concepts or specific linguistic terms. For example, ways of addressing your family, or even things like food, like do you translate them or do you use the original term? So I think these things come up for me a lot as a writer already. So when I got the chance to translate, or when I encounter things that I find really interesting in Chinese and that drew me to want to translate them, I could actually use a lot of the things that I've already been thinking about in English and just transfer that into translation. So that's kind of how I got started.
It sounds like your life as a writer, as in your original work, and your life as a translator have been feeding each other.
Yeah.
In a big way, having an impact one on the other.
Yeah, that was surprising for me, but I guess it makes sense now that I think about it, that of course translation would be a good fit just because of all the different interests and language skills. Another thing, I guess, was I started being interested in writing a fantasy novel in English that kind of drew on like wuxia, like martial arts fiction. And so I started doing all this research about, how the genre works and how could you maybe translate kind of the genre tradition and this all terminology and cultural element into English. And that's something also that's very similar to translation as well.
Are there works that haven't been translated yet that you really wish someone would bring from Chinese into English? Yeah,
I think Chinese works, a lot of them actually have not been widely translated. We definitely see, I think, more and more works being translated now in terms of fantasy and science fiction because of translators like Ken Liu and his work, advocating for a lot of science fiction being translated. But in general, I would say I think a lot of the works are still not that well known. And we also have the issue of a lot of the early translations have been unfortunately done by like white authors or white translators who were coming at it from like a more Orientalist perspective. In that context, I think there can be like a lot of work still needs to be done in terms of translating in general. Personally, I really a lot of the Chinese folktales, and I would say that because there's so many of them, and a lot of them haven't been translated. And then in terms of modern authors, I'm just interested in translating, I think, a lot of modern kind of women poets. and also fantasy writers, because I think there is a bias in terms of who gets published and who gets translated. And I just want to be mindful in really seeking out voices who I want to support and voices who I think are maybe being overlooked.
And what kinds of things are you drawn to write yourself? I mean, you talked about poetry and a novel and short stories, but what themes draw you? What qualities draw you?
It's interesting because right now I'm working on a short story collection that I'm completing, and also like a poetry chapbook. I think it's always challenging to describe your own work, but I've noticed that I think a common theme that's been popping up in my short story collection is relationships and connections across vast distances, which makes sense because I grew up living in different parts of the world, and as a member of the Chinese diaspora, that's something that emerged over and over again. And I talked a little bit, I'm just kind of very interested in, I think, also just folk tales and magic, the supernatural elements. I have a lot of poems apparently about ghosts for some reason of various kinds. Yeah, so those are just some things that I've personally noticed.
Because ghosts often carry messages about trauma hidden inside those stories. I mean, they can.
Sometimes. But I think I'm kind of generalizing here, but I think Chinese understanding of ghosts could also be, I think, very different from Western ones, because I think for us, a lot of ghosts are about like ancestors and heritage and passing down of knowledge. I have a lot of benevolent ghosts as well, more like a connection to the past in general.
Well, thank you for joining us, Yilin, and
we really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Much.
I think it adds a dimension to what we talk about, which is very interesting, very different from what we usually talk about. So,
yeah, thank you. This was really fun. You have really good questions.
So I hope you've learned everything you always wanted to know about translating from our friend Yilin.
Oh, close to everything. Next episode, we're going to be talking about the urban versus the rural and how those themes can play out in writing fiction.
So hope to see you then. If you like what you're watching, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel or podcast. And see you next time.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.